Morning, everyone. Good to be here with you all. It's a beautiful day to wake up and come and worship God with you all this morning. And if you're visiting with us, just want to welcome you, and hopefully we can talk to you afterwards. And just want to encourage you, if you ever have any questions or thoughts or concerns, you can always come and talk to us. We're always open and eager to have a good discussion about those things. I would ask you to open up your Bibles to Judges chapter 13. That's where we will begin our lesson this morning. And we're going to be talking about the story of Samson. Samson is a complicated figure in the biblical story, at least he is to me, because we're told that God used him. Obviously, he used him. We all recognize that. He was one of the judges or deliverers of Israel in that era of judges that we read about in the book. The Spirit of God rushes upon him, gives him power to do all this crazy stuff that we read about. However, had we not been given those details, had we just kind of observed various moments in Samson's life without those details, it feels like all the complexity of Samson and his character would be totally removed. When we learn about the judges and the Bible classes that we have growing up, for me, Samson was one of my favorites. He kind of comes across as a superhero. If there's anybody that we can make a Marvel superhero movie about from the Bible, it would be the person of Samson. But naturally, when we're teaching stories to our kids, we tend to kind of give a glossary. It's kind of whitewashing, these people that we read about in the story, because the cool thing about the Bible is that it doesn't hide the fact that the leaders of God's people throughout the Bible were very imperfect, often deeply flawed individuals. And so Samson's life fits that mold entirely. There are many grisly details in Samson's life that are probably not appropriate to cover for all age groups when you're going through his story and laying it out. So we just kind of give the overview version of how he went to battle against the Philistines. But even in an adult setting, we can sometimes approach the book of Judges with this tendency to see the judges, all of them as heroes, not just heroes in the sense of rescuing a group of people or being a strong warrior, but we look at them through rose-tinted glasses and tend to see them as people that led exemplary lives. There's a problem when you do that with the life of Samson. Because inevitably, as you're reading his story, and if you're trying to use him as an example of this is what it looks like to be faithful to God and walk in his footsteps, it kind of puts you in a bind, where you're eventually forced to either ignore or somehow make an excuse or explain away obvious and really not even occasional acts of disobedience that we see throughout his life. In fact, there is a pattern of transgression in Samson's life. And in some cases, we see just a total disregard for God and his will. There is a mantra which is alive and well in the world today as much as it has ever been, and it is a mantra that characterizes and is the theme really of the whole book of Judges. We're told multiple times at the end of the book that in those days there was no king. There was nobody to lead them, nobody to rally around, nobody to tell them what to do, and so the result was everybody just did what was right in their own eyes. And that is the moral compass for a lot of people today, is that if it feels right, if it looks good, if it seems right, then it is right. And so the interesting thing about Judges is there's this downward spiral as you read through it where the people are getting worse and worse and worse and worse. And the judges, when you read them, they're really mirroring the people as well. The judges become a reflection of the times that they live in. And so Samson ultimately embodied, or perhaps was even a product of his time. Because we see in his own life, his own mantra is the mantra of all the people by the time you get down to the end of the book of Judges. It is the words, "right in my eyes." If Samson felt it, if he saw it, and he wanted it, he acted on it. He acted in accord to it. But as I said, he is a complex figure, and even his ending is complex and messy. But that's probably not all dissimilar to each of us in the room this morning. But I just want to start off in Judges chapter 13 and just start at the beginning of his life. And the beginning of the life of Samson starts with a blessing. It's not all that dissimilar to the stories of Jesus or John the Baptist when their birth is announced, that you have this husband and wife who are barren and they can't have any kids. And that was a huge tragedy in those days to not be able to do that, especially to not have a son. And then all of a sudden an angel shows up to this man's wife and announces that she's going to get pregnant, that she's going to have this miraculous child given to her and blessed in her life. And it's not just a story about this happy ending between a husband and wife who didn't have a kid and now they finally do get a kid. There is a divine purpose behind this miraculous divine announcement of this couple having a child. And so his entrance into this world, even at the very conception, is framed as a blessing especially for his mom and dad. And we're told again that this is for a purpose, that God's going to bless him with this child, but this child is to be set apart for a particular purpose in his life. And so you find that in chapter 13 and the second half of verse 5. At the end of that verse it says, "He shall begin to save Israel from the hand of the Philistines." All throughout the book of Judges, you've had this pattern repeating where they apostatize, they stop obeying God. God lets them become captive of a foreign nation, a surrounding army, and then they cry out to God because their backs are against the wall, and then God sends a judge and brings them out of captivity. You see that pattern all throughout Judges repeating over and over and over again. The interesting thing, when you read the book of Judges and read Samson's story, the people are no longer even really crying out to God. In fact, when Samson begins to have conflict with the Philistines, the people of Judah are coming to him and they're complaining, "Look what you're doing to us." And so by the time we get to Samson, he's the last of the judges, the people are not only subject to this foreign nation in Philistia, but they're complacent. They seem to kind of roll over and accepted their fate. And so here comes Samson. Samson is going to be this one that kicks up the bee's nest. And I want you to notice that his mission is to begin to save Israel from the hand of the Philistines. King David is the one that would finish this work. Samson is the one that's going to start it. And the way he goes about eventually makes peace between Israel and Philistia almost impossible. But this is his explicit purpose. It's to defeat the Philistines and save Israel from them. But I would say there's also an implied purpose in verse 5 as well. I want you to read something very interesting at the beginning of this verse. When the angel is speaking to Manoah's wife, that's his Samson's mother, it says, "Behold, you shall conceive and bear a son. No razor shall come upon his head, for the child shall be a Nazirite to God from the womb, and he shall begin to save Israel from the hand of the Philistines." Samson is told, or his mother's told, that he's going to be a Nazirite. This is a very interesting vow that you read about in Numbers chapter 6. The word Nazirite literally means to be dedicated, to be separated, to be consecrated, to be devoted to something. And so what you would have in Numbers is you would have people that would take this special vow. It wasn't a vow that you had to take. It was one that you voluntarily would take up. And you would basically agree to follow basically a stricter lifestyle than even what the law prescribed. And so there were really three things involved in the Nazirite vow that were really important. Somebody who took this vow was to, it's interesting, in Numbers it says, not only are you not to eat or drink anything that is the product of a vine, not even the skin of a grape, but it actually uses even more restrictive language than that in number 6. It says that you are to separate yourself from wine. And then it says you're not to touch any dead bodies. And then finally it says that a Nazirite shall not allow a razor to touch his hair, that they're to grow their hair out. And so one person summarizes the Nazirite vow in this way: it was meant to be a living picture of moderation and self-denial in a culture sliding into self-indulgence. Let me say that again. It was meant to be a living picture of moderation and self-denial. If there are two words that are the total opposite of how one would describe Samson, it is moderation and self-denial. But this is so interesting because no other judge is placed under this vow, how Samson is, even from his conception. And I think the implied purpose here is that God doesn't just want Samson to be a warrior that goes out and smashes the Philistines, the Blitherenes. He wants him to do it as somebody devoted to God, in the name of God. He doesn't just want him to be a military leader. He wants him to be a spiritual leader that will not only deliver Israel from the Philistines, but will bring the people back to God. It's very interesting as you go through and look at the life of Samson, you begin to see his motives are very different than God's purpose for him. We've already kind of established this in the introduction, but go ahead and turn to Numbers chapter 14. And before we get to that, I do want to be fair to Samson, and I want to say that there are some things that in a certain sense are admirable and you know, are worth taking into consideration. And I think the two things that stand out about Samson as we look at his life, and all of us are kind of familiar with his story, is this is a man that had courage, and he had this willingness to act. There's one preacher that I heard recently say, you know, if there were a man-eating lion released in the United States of America, he's worried that the lion would starve to death because the lion wouldn't be able to find any men. Samson is a man of courage, and when it comes time to act, he acts. He is kind of the picture in many ways, maybe not the most biblical or pure picture, but he is, it's hard to argue, he is a man's man. He doesn't second guess himself when it's time to act. He doesn't analyze. He doesn't question. He is somebody who does. And I'll tell you what, the church is never running short of men like that. Men who are warriors. Men who are willing to act when they recognize something needs to be done rather than sit around and talk about it and think about it and second guess it. But here's the problem with Samson. It wasn't really his passion. It wasn't his courage. It wasn't his can-do attitude. The problem with Samson is what all of those things were directed towards accomplishing. The problem with Samson is the thing that motivated his passion and his courage and his can-do spirit was not God. It was himself. Samson was on Team Samson. Everything in his life from the beginning, from when we're introduced to him as an adult, is self-centric and done for his own sake. Irrespectable of others, even his own parents, but most importantly, of God. And so again, look at Samson's very first words, and that's significant. When the Bible introduces us to somebody and these are their first words, it means something. And so in Judges chapter 14, Samson, he's going to Timnah, which is in Philistia, and it says in verse 1 that he saw one of the daughters of the Philistines. And then he came up and told his father and mother, I saw one of the daughters of the Philistines at Timnah. Now get her for me as a wife. But his father and mother said to him, is there not a woman among the daughters of your relatives or among all our people that you must go take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? But Samson said to his father, get her for me, for she is right in my eyes. Again, in verse 7, the author of Judges talks about Samson in this way, that he went down and talked with this woman, and it says she was right in Samson's eyes. There are Samson's first words, and there's the author emphasizing this idea, mentioning it twice to make sure that you get the point, that you catch it. The law in Israel was don't intermarry. Don't marry foreign wives that have foreign gods. His parents remind him of this, and he says, yeah, I don't care about that. Get her for me because she is right in my eyes. This is not just a one-off instance for Samson. This is the mantra that guided his entire life. This is his philosophy to decision-making and making important choices. And so it's not just with this woman, but it is a pattern that you see progressively throughout his life. It first starts with him marrying this Philistine woman. And then he tears apart this lion and he leaves it there for dead, and he comes back and he takes the honey. So he found some honey in the lion carcass and he reaches in and he grabs it. That's breaking the Nazirite vow. He is touching a dead body. Later on, he's going down into Timnah, and it says that he is walking amongst the vineyards, kind of tempting fate with this Nazirite vow involving wine. And it even says that he threw a party. And when you look up in the Hebrew, the word for party there specifically implies this idea of a drinking party. And that involves breaking his Nazirite vow as well. When he's fighting 1,000 men, he reaches over and he grabs the fresh jawbone of a donkey, once again touching a dead body, using it as a weapon. Later on in his life, he has a one-night stand with a prostitute. He repeatedly eroded the separation his Nazirite vow was supposed to represent. In just about every story that you read of Samson, his eyes were more important than God's eyes. And so he's constantly seeing what he wants and going after what he wants, irrespective of his parents, irrespective of people around him, irrespective of even what God desires for him. And one of the things that he wanted most in life was personal vengeance. You know, it is interesting in verse 4 of Judges chapter 14, and verse 4 of Judges 14, when it's talking about this woman that he saw that was right in his eyes, it gives us this note in verse 4. It says, his father and mother did not know that it was from the Lord. For he was seeking an opportunity against the Philistines. At that time, the Philistine rulers ruled over Israel. A lot of people have taken that to say, well, see, God approves of what Samson is doing. And I think really what this is saying is that God was working in spite of Samson, or despite Samson, not because of Samson. It's not as though Samson just had to marry a Philistine for God's will to be accomplished. Indeed, he's intending really to do the opposite of what God had set him apart for. He set Samson aside to go and defeat the Philistines. And what is Samson intending to do? He's intending to marry into the Philistine family. In fact, when you read him marry this woman, and then he goes away, it's a long story, and he's gone a long time, and so he gets married off to another man. It says that the father of his wife married her off to his companion, a best man, at his wedding. And in context, we're told that all the companions that were there at the wedding were Philistines. And so he's not just marrying into a Philistine family, but even somebody that is his best man at his wedding was a Philistine. None of the other judges needed to marry a foreign wife to accomplish God's purposes, but if that's what Samson was intending to do, God says, okay, I can use that. You're not going to fight them. You're not going to seek an opportunity. You're not going to rally the troops against them. Fine, marry one, and my purposes will still be accomplished through you anyways. Samson doesn't so much accomplish God's will against the Philistines so much as he basically stumbles into doing it. And so we see this pattern of personal vengeance and this riddle in chapter 14 that he gives them to solve, and they solve it by interrogating his wife, and he's mad, so he goes and kills 30 men and settles the bet that he made with them. And then they're angry, and he finds out that his wife is married away, and so then he reacts again and responds, and then they react to him, and then he reacts again. And it's at the center of it, never is God mentioned. Never is there this desire even to deliver Israel. It's all about settling his personal vendetta and how God uses it to accomplish his will anyways. Even in his final prayer, before he dies in Judges 16 and verse 28, what is it that Samson most of all is focused on? He's got his hands on the pillar. He says, Lord God, remember me and please strengthen me only this once, O God, that I may be avenged on the Philistines for my 2 eyes. He's motivated by his eyes, and he was motivated by getting even with his enemies. And so we see that everything that motivated him, these 2 kind of pillars in his life, are really the opposite of what God's purpose was for Samson. Again, we get insight into Samson's thinking in chapter 15 and in verse 18. We see that he's even this kind of self-deluded individual, having almost died after killing 1,000 with the jawbone of a donkey. In chapter 15, verse 18, it says he was thirsty. And he called upon the Lord and said, now listen to this. After all this mess that he's created and after all the sin that he's committed, it says in verse 18, you have granted this great salvation by the hand of your servant. And shall I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the circumcised? It's by the grace of God that God answers his prayer and provides water for him miraculously in that instance. But at what point in Samson's life can we say that he was really serving God? Who was he serving? He was serving himself. And it was God's Spirit enabling him to do these things. But again, who was it for? It was for himself. And so we can clearly see on one level, Samson fulfilled God's purpose. But again, it was often despite Samson rather than because of him. He did begin to deliver Israel from the Philistines. But then in another sense, he failed epically. He's the last man you'd think of when you talk about somebody being devoted or consecrated or set aside for God. One who intermarries against God's law, sleeps with prostitutes. Samson's role, ideally, would have been and done more than simply deliver them from the Philistines, but also to deliver them to God. And he proves totally incapable of that level of leadership throughout his life. In fact, I mentioned when he's confronted by the elders having these back and forths with the Philistines, the elders of Judah come to him and they're basically complaining to him, and they don't look good in this section either. But I want you to look at what Samson focuses on, what the content of his speech is all about. And this is a prime opportunity to rally the troops and to get them focused on the things of God. But look at where he directs their minds in chapter 15. In verse 11, it says, the 3,000 men of Judah went down to the cleft of the rock of Etam and said to Samson, do you not know that the Philistines are rulers over us? What then is this that you've done to us? And he said to them, as they did to me, so I have done to them. And they said to him, we have come down to bind you, that we may give you into the hands of the Philistines. And Samson said to them, swear to me that you will not attack me yourselves. What's Samson focused on? Himself. How does he frame these back and forths with Philistia? Not for God, but hey, I'm just doing what they did to me. You know, Samson and David are connected because they both kind of had the same mission, which was to rout out the Philistines. And I think David just provides such a sharp contrast of what Samson was, where David, at least early on in his life, he was this warrior. And he shows up and he defeats Goliath. But what was kind of central, and what was the whole reason that David stepped onto the battlefield against Goliath to begin with? Who is this Philistine that defies the name of the Lord? And all throughout this back and forth that he has with Saul, at what point could David have made that about himself and settling a vendetta against Saul? He had every right and every reason and every opportunity to approach Saul in that way. Can you imagine if Samson was in David's shoes when he was being persecuted by Saul? David lets him off the hook twice. Samson, I think, probably would have put an end to him in an instant. Faithfulness to God and not self was central to David's leadership. But with Samson, it always came back around to being about him. And so there's a couple important, I think, lessons and principles for leaders. And I'm talking about all leaders. I'm talking about in the church. I'm talking about in your families, even at work, but especially in spiritual settings. Our goal is not just to lead people from something. Now, that is a big, important part of our goal. That we want to demolish idols in our homes. We want to guard our homes and protect it against corrupting influences coming in and infecting the spiritual lives of our children. We want to do our best to help them unlearn the bad habits that they've developed in their life, but that is only half the battle. That if we are leading them from evil, but not leading them to God, all of it ends up being fruitless in the end. As you see in the book of Judges, after the story of Samson, the last two stories are the most depraved and the most problematic that we see Israel in throughout the whole book. And yet, who is the enemy in the last 4 chapters of Judges? It isn't Philistines. It isn't the Canaanites. It's not some foreign nation. Who is it? It's themselves. It's themselves. They could deliver them from all sorts of foreign nations, but in that moment, what they needed was to be turned back to God. That's our goal. Is yes, deliver people from evil. Lead them from evil, lead them from temptation, but also lead them in relationship and shepherd them in a relationship to God. Secondly, leadership becomes impossible. It's either non-existent or it's totally corrupted when our leadership style prioritizes allegiance to self over allegiance to God. When we lead people in our lives and we draw the line, it's either me or them. It's either my choice or this choice. People are going to struggle to rally around that. They want a higher purpose, a higher calling to follow. And you see this in Samson's life. That if he had got them to see this is God's battle, and if he had fought it in that manner, perhaps it would rally around them. But from what their vantage point was, they're just getting involved in another personal vendetta that Samson's trying to settle. And so all of Samson's life, he was a lone wolf, and the people were worse off for it. And so we see a lot of times what's interesting with Samson is it worked out for a while. He's got this back and forth, and despite him breaking several aspects of his Nazirite vow, and despite him sleeping with prostitutes, things just seem to kind of have a way of working out for Samson. He gets his back against the wall against a 1,000-man army, and no big deal, I'll grab a jawbone of a donkey and I'll kill them all. And God provides water for him in the end. God was exceedingly merciful to Samson until he wasn't. The same mistake he had made with his wife earlier on, who had betrayed him. He ends up linking up with this woman named Delilah, and the Philistines are trying to figure out what the secret is to Samson's strength, and 3 times Delilah betrays him. And he throws her off his scent a couple times, but finally he says, if you cut my hair, I'll lose all my strength. And she does that. He gets up expecting to have strength, and the Philistines come in and overwhelm him and defeat him and bind him in shackles. What's really interesting about that story in Judges 16 is it tells us Samson rose up when they're coming into the room. It indicates that he expected strength to be there, even though he told Delilah about cutting his hair. It almost depicts him as being surprised that God's strength wasn't there for him when it came time to fight his enemies once again. And my question is why? Why is he surprised? And I think it's because we often kind of miss really what was the source of Samson's strength. It really wasn't his hair. It was the Spirit of God. Even in the last story, it says his hair is beginning to grow strong, and I get that's linking to his strength, but who is it that he's depending on to push those pillars down in the end? It was God. I think the reason Samson is surprised is because why would he expect any different? He'd made all his own decisions, had cast aside God's will, and had kind of lived irrespective of what God wanted for him multiple times throughout his life, and it always seemed to work out. Why would it be any different if he had his hair cut? He'd touch dead bodies. He'd probably drink wine. Why would it be any different now? The significance of the hair is that it represented this last strand, no pun intended, of an area where Samson was actually exercising submission to God. It was the last leg of the chair. And finally, he tempted fate one too many times. God was exceedingly merciful to Samson until he wasn't. There is a lie about sin. It sounds good, but I think it ultimately can yield negative results. It's one that we often use to guard our kids from committing sin. And that lie is that as Christians and Christian circles, we believe that when we sin, we will always feel guilty, and that consequences will always be immediate. Can I tell you something? Just be honest. Sometimes sin feels good. There are times where sin even feels right. Or else why do you have all these passages about not trusting your heart? There's a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. There are times where sin feels good and it feels right. But we've been raised our whole lives and we're told the minute I sin, I'm going to feel guilty. The minute I sin, I'm going to feel like I'm doing something wrong. And then we sin and we find out, actually, I feel pretty good. And I don't feel too guilty. And we're emboldened towards our sin, and we say, well, nothing has happened yet. What's the big deal? I think this passage in Romans 2, verses 4 through 5 is relevant. When we don't experience those consequences, that's not a sign that God doesn't care. There are times where God is patient with us, even in our sin. And what is his patience and kindness intended to do in verse 4 of Romans 2? Do you presume on the riches of his kindness and forbearance and patience, not knowing that God's kindness is meant to lead you to repentance? But because of your hard and impenitent heart, you are storing up wrath for yourself on the day of wrath when God's righteous judgment will be rewarded. The point is, sin might not catch up to you right when you do it. It might catch up to you when you're 80 or when you're 18. But one day, the day of wrath is going to come. You know, we live in this world right now where we do everything that's right in our own eyes, and I want to talk about for a moment somebody that's kind of a product of this as well. I don't know, has anybody heard of this kid named Clavicular is his nickname. And his whole philosophy to life is he says man's purpose, talking specifically of males, is to ascend. And his idea of ascending is what he calls looks-maxing, where to be better than other men, you have to look better than them. And so he has manipulated his body in all sorts of ways, gone through these grotesque processes to give himself different facial structure, different bone structure, to increase his height. And he's this huge influencer amongst young people, by the way. He's 21. One of the more controversial ways that he goes about looks-maxing is he takes methamphetamine. He's talked openly about this in an interview because it helps him maintain lean muscle mass. And so a lot of kids look at this and they either think it's funny or they're taking this stuff serious, and both of which reactions are scary. And I don't know if you caught in the news this last week, Clavicular ended up in the hospital because he overdosed on a substance. And he doesn't want to talk about it. He came out of it. He almost died. He came out of it. He doesn't want to talk about it. Why? Because it would totally undercut his philosophical message. His life looks entertaining. It's full of glamour and fancy suits, and he's a good-looking guy, and he's got women. Here's what you need to do, young people. Your algorithm puts influencers in front of you, and it is a snapshot of their life, and they drop off, and we don't ever know what happened to them. Now more than ever, it's important that you consider the long-term consequences of actions. Sin puts your life on a trajectory. And I am astounded by all these famous people that are around my age. And we looked at them like they had it made, and we all wanted to be them and famous like them. And now that they're my age, they wish they were like me. Normal and unknown. Because they were involved in things that they shouldn't have been involved in, when they were 17, 18, 19, 20 years old. That's Samson. It's a story of a life and the trajectory that he was set on by living right according to his own eyes and where it ultimately ends up. The strong man became weak. The man who couldn't be bound became a slave. The man who walked according to his own eyes, you notice it? His eyes are gouged out. But here's what complicates the whole story of Samson. Hebrews 11, verse 32, what we call the hall of faith, people call it that. I don't call it that. Samson's mentioned in this list of people who through faith conquered kingdoms and who were made strong out of weakness and among other things. Can I be honest with you? Hebrews 11 is a hall of salvage. It's a bunch of deeply flawed individuals. And the reason this adds complexity to Samson's character is because we look at this, and I think our tendency often is to say, well, look, he must have been saved, but I don't think that's what Hebrews 11 is doing. Hebrews 11, what it's doing is it's showing us people who depended on God for something at a time in their life, and God delivered. Samson depended on God for strength in this final prayer of his life, and God answered. That's what it's teaching us. I think we're missing the point if we look at that and we say, see, he made it in the end. He went to heaven. We're putting ourselves in the exact same position Samson was in, who said, well, I can do whatever I want, and God's Spirit isn't going to leave me. That misses the warning of Samson's life. For years, he presumed on God's mercy, lived by whatever was right in his own eyes until the last strand of his calling was cut and the Spirit left him. Yes, God can salvage deeply broken people, but he doesn't want to just salvage us. He wants to use our faithfulness. But here is the lesson of Samson in the end. When he prays to God. And whatever that prayer means or whatever that prayer meant for his afterlife, I have no idea. But here's what it teaches us, is despite all the sin and stubbornness and selfishness in Samson's life, in his final moments, he calls on God, and God was listening. And he answered his prayer. Maybe you haven't lived up to your purpose, and you've been living according to your own purpose. And you've made a mess of your life, and your back is against a wall. I have good news for you. You aren't Samson. You aren't dead yet. And God stands ready to hear your prayers. But don't just call out to him for vengeance on your enemies. Call out to him for salvation. Call out to him in repentance, and he will hear you. Because there's a better Samson, Jesus Christ, and he lived a perfectly consecrated life to the Father. He never presumed on God's kindness. By his death and resurrection, he accomplished what Samson only could begin to do, and that is full deliverance from sin and self-rule. But we got to stop living the way that's right in our own eyes. You know, I want to highlight one last thing before we wrap up. There is a parallel in Samson's life in the New Testament. There's another man on a cross, facing death. Samson cries to God, "Remember me. Give me strength." Luke 21, verse 42, there's a thief. He lived according to the way that was right in his own eyes his entire life. He gets hung on a cross, and he acknowledges, I deserve this. This is the result of my actions. But he says, this man in the middle is innocent. And he looks to him and he says, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus listened to him. If you've reached a dead end, you're weak, you're enslaved to sin, you're blind, Samson and the thief both show us this. God stands ready to hear your cry. Come to Jesus. Don't put it off. Don't wait for the judgment and wrath. He can make you strong, and he can and will save your soul if that's what you seek from him. If you're here today and you'd like to be baptized for the remission of your sins in the name of Jesus, you can do so today. Or if you have any other spiritual needs, why don't you come and talk to me in the back while we stand and sing the song of invitation.